You see them standing on that podium in Berlin, August 1936, 3 black American athletes with medals around their necks, and what you don't know, what history has carefully avoided telling you, is that this moment didn't just embarrass Adolf Hitler, it shattered his entire ideology in front of the world and set in motion a chain of events that would eventually help dismantle Jim Crow America. But let's back up, because to understand why this matters, you need to know what was happening in that stadium, in that city, in that exact moment when Jesse Owens, Ralph Metcalfe, and their teammates stepped onto German soil and walked straight into Hitler's propaganda machine. It's 1936, and Nazi Germany has spent years preparing for these Olympic Games, pouring millions into constructing a massive complex designed to showcase Aryan supremacy to the entire world. Hitler himself deeply invested in proving his racial theories through athletic competition, genuinely believing that his blonde-haired, blue-eyed athletes would dominate every event and provide living proof of genetic superiority. And then Jesse Owens shows up. Born James Cleveland Owens in Oakville, Alabama, in 1913, the grandson of enslaved people, growing up in Cleveland, Ohio after his family joined the Great Migration, picking cotton as a child, arriving at Ohio State University where he wasn't allowed to live on campus because of his race, couldn't eat in the same restaurants as his white teammates, had to stay in blacks-only hotels when the team traveled. And yet this man, this black American athlete competing for a country that treated him as a second-class citizen, would become the most dominant force these Olympic Games had ever seen. But here's what makes this story even more powerful, more important than just one man's athletic achievement. Owens wasn't alone. He was part of a larger delegation of 18 black athletes who competed for the United States in Berlin, athletes like high jumper Cornelius Johnson, boxer Jackie Wilson, and sprinter Ralph Metcalfe, each carrying the weight of representing not just their country but their entire race in a world that questioned their very humanity. The German propaganda machine had prepared for these games meticulously, thousands of swastika flags hanging throughout Berlin, Hitler planning to greet and congratulate German victors personally, using the Olympics as a showcase for Nazi ideology. And then August 3, 1936 arrives, and Jesse Owens steps onto the track for the 100-meter final. You need to understand the pressure on this man's shoulders in that moment. He's competing in a stadium filled with over 100,000 spectators, many of them Nazi supporters, Hitler himself watching from his box, Owens knowing that billions of people around the world would hear about this race, that every black person in America was counting on him, that white supremacists everywhere wanted him to fail because his failure would confirm their beliefs. And what does Jesse Owens do? He explodes off those blocks and crosses the finish line in 10.3 seconds, winning the gold medal and tying the Olympic record, and the crowd goes wild despite themselves because greatness transcends prejudice when you witness it firsthand. But Owens wasn't done, not even close, because 4 days later he's back on that track competing in the 200-meter dash, and despite running on a rain-soaked track that should have slowed him down, he wins gold again, this time setting a new Olympic record of 20.7 seconds. And you can imagine Hitler in his box, watching his Aryan supremacy theory crumble with each stride Owens takes. Then comes the long jump, and this is where the story gets even more remarkable because Owens had fouled on his first 2 attempts, was 1 fault away from elimination, when German competitor Luz Long, a tall, blonde, blue-eyed athlete who embodied everything the Nazi regime celebrated, walked over and gave Owens advice on his approach, helped him adjust his technique, essentially ensuring that his ideological enemy would succeed, and Owens not only qualified but went on to win the gold medal. These athletes returned to an America that still enforced Jim Crow laws. Jesse Owens couldn't stay in the same hotels as his white teammates when they toured after the Olympics, had to ride freight elevators to reach reception rooms held in his honor, wasn't invited to the White House by President Franklin Roosevelt who feared alienating Southern white voters. Owens himself later saying, "Hitler didn't snub me. It was our president who snubbed me. The president didn't even send me a telegram." And think about that for a moment. This man won 4 gold medals for his country, became the most celebrated athlete in the world, shattered racist ideology on the world stage, and came home to a nation that still wouldn't let him vote in many states, still forced him to use separate water fountains, still denied him basic human dignity. Ralph Metcalfe, who won silver in the 100 meters and gold in the 4x100 relay, would later become a U.S. congressman and a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus, spending his political career fighting against the very discrimination he faced as an Olympic champion, understanding that athletic excellence didn't protect Black Americans from systematic oppression. But here's the deeper story, the one that connects those Olympics to the civil rights movement that would emerge decades later. These Black athletes proved something that couldn't be denied, couldn't be explained away, couldn't be rationalized by white supremacist ideology. They proved that Black excellence was undeniable when given the opportunity to compete on equal terms, and that proof, witnessed by millions around the world, planted seeds that would eventually grow into demands for equality. The Nazi regime tried to minimize the Black athletes' success, German newspapers initially downplaying their achievements, but the evidence was too overwhelming, too public, too spectacular to ignore, and Hitler's frustration was so evident that even German citizens noticed, stories circulating about his anger and early departures from the stadium. What you need to understand is that these Olympics occurred at a specific moment in history when two forms of white supremacy, American Jim Crow and German Nazism, both claimed scientific justification for their racist policies, both insisted on the biological inferiority of Black people, and both were exposed as fraudulent by the performance of 18 Black American athletes over 2 weeks in August 1936. Jesse Owens would later work various jobs to support his family, at one point racing against horses for money because endorsement deals went to white athletes, eventually finding work as a playground director and public speaker, never receiving the financial benefits that white Olympic champions enjoyed, yet his legacy grew over time as people began to understand what he'd truly accomplished. The other Black Olympians faced similar challenges. Cornelius Johnson worked in the post office, John Woodruff became a teacher and parole officer, Archie Williams served as a pilot instructor during World War II when the military was still segregated. These men who had represented America at its finest were still treated as inferior citizens when they returned home. But something changed, slowly, imperceptibly at first, because those images of Black athletes dominating in Berlin couldn't be erased from public consciousness. Newsreel footage of Owens sprinting past white competitors was shown in theaters across America. Photographs of Black athletes on Olympic podiums appeared in newspapers nationwide, and while racist attitudes didn't disappear overnight, the undeniable evidence of Black excellence began to erode the pseudoscientific justifications for segregation. When Jackie Robinson broke baseball's color barrier in 1947, he carried the legacy of those 1936 Olympians. When the Supreme Court ruled on Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the justices understood that separate could never be equal, partly because the world had seen what Black Americans could achieve when given opportunity. And when the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, it represented the culmination of a movement that had been gathering strength since Jesse Owens first crossed that finish line in Berlin. The story of these Black Olympians matters because it reveals a truth that resonates today. Representation matters, visibility matters. Seeing Black excellence in action changes hearts and minds in ways that arguments alone cannot. And while systemic racism required legal and political action to dismantle, the cultural shift that made such action possible began with moments like these, when Black Americans proved their worth so undeniably that even their enemies had to acknowledge it. Jesse Owens would eventually receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Gerald Ford in 1976, 40 years after his Olympic triumph. A recognition that came far too late but symbolized America's slow reckoning with its racist past. And when Owens died in 1980, his funeral was attended by thousands who understood that he was more than an athlete. He was a pioneer who had challenged white supremacy at its source and won. The 1936 Olympics also created an interesting historical irony that's worth noting. Nazi Germany hoped to use Black American athletes' success against the United States, pointing to Owens died in 1980. His funeral was attended by thousands who understood that he was more than an athlete. He was a pioneer who had challenged white supremacy at its source and won. The 1936 Olympics also created an interesting historical irony that's worth noting. Nazi Germany hoped to use Black American athletes' success against the United States, pointing to American segregation and discrimination as evidence of hypocrisy, essentially saying, "You criticize us while treating your own black citizens terribly," and they weren't wrong about American racism. But what they didn't anticipate was that the black athletes' excellence would ultimately undermine both Nazi ideology and American Jim Crow, creating a benchmark of achievement that made racial discrimination increasingly indefensible. Ralph Metcalfe's journey from Olympic sprinter to civil rights congressman illustrates this transformation perfectly. He used his platform as an athlete to build credibility, then leveraged that credibility to fight systematic injustice, investigating police brutality cases in Chicago, challenging FBI surveillance of black activists, understanding that his gold medal gave him a voice that he could use to demand change. And let's talk about the other black athletes who competed in Berlin, because their stories deserve recognition. Jackie Wilson, the boxer who fought his way to a silver medal despite facing opponents who wanted to prove black inferiority through violence, or Fritz Pollard Jr., son of the first black NFL coach, who competed in the 110-meter hurdles, or Dave Alberton, who won silver in the high jump alongside his teammate Cornelius Johnson's gold, creating an all-black American podium that must have infuriated Nazi propagandists. These weren't just athletes, they were warriors fighting a different kind of battle, every performance a refutation of racist ideology, every medal a blow against white supremacy, and they did it while representing a country that denied them basic rights, that forced them to compete while knowing they'd return home to discrimination, segregation, and violence. The courage that required cannot be overstated. Imagine training for years, sacrificing everything for your sport, knowing that half your own country hopes you'll fail because your success challenges their worldview, and then traveling to Nazi Germany where another group of white supremacists wants to see you defeated, and still finding the strength, the focus, the determination to perform at the highest possible level. That's not just athletic ability, that's a profound act of resistance, a declaration of humanity in the face of dehumanization, and it's why these black Olympians deserve to be remembered not just as athletes but as civil rights pioneers who fought their battles on the track, in the field, and in the ring. The impact of their achievements rippled through black communities across America. Children saw these athletes and dreamed bigger dreams. Parents pointed to Jesse Owens and told their kids that black excellence was real and undeniable. Churches celebrated these victories as evidence of God's justice, and slowly, painfully slowly, white Americans began to question whether the racial hierarchies they'd been taught were actually true. This is why Hitler feared these athletes, why he left the stadium rather than congratulate them, why Nazi propaganda tried so desperately to minimize their achievements, because their success threatened the entire foundation of racial ideology, proved that when black people had opportunity and training and support, they could excel beyond anyone's imagination. And that proof was dangerous to any system built on the lie of white superiority. The 1936 Olympics created a moment that couldn't be taken back, a demonstration of black excellence that was too public, too spectacular, too overwhelming to ignore or explain away. And while it didn't immediately end racism or discrimination, it planted seeds of doubt in minds that had never questioned white supremacy. It gave ammunition to those fighting for civil rights, and it proved that black Americans deserved equality not through moral argument alone but through undeniable demonstration of capability. When you see those grainy photographs of Jesse Owens on the Olympic podium, understand that you're looking at more than a sporting achievement. You're witnessing a turning point in history, a moment when one man's excellence challenged an empire's ideology and won, when black Americans proved their worth on the world stage despite every obstacle their own country and Nazi Germany could place in their path. And you're seeing the beginning of a transformation that would eventually lead to the civil rights movement, to the end of legal segregation, to a slow, painful reckoning with America's racist past. These black Olympians who defied Hitler didn't just win medals, they changed history. They challenged white supremacy at its moment of peak confidence and power. They represented hope for millions of black Americans who saw in their success a glimpse of what equality might look like, and they did it all while knowing they'd return to a country that still refused to grant them basic human rights. So remember their names: Jesse Owens, Ralph Metcalfe, Cornelius Johnson, John Woodruff, Archie Williams, Dave Alberton, Jackie Wilson, Fritz Pollard Jr., James Louva, Mack Robinson. Yes, Jackie Robinson's older brother who won silver in the 200 meters, and the other black athletes who competed in Berlin, Because their courage, their excellence, their determination to succeed despite everything working against them helped pave the way for every black athlete, every black professional, every black American who came after them. They stood on that podium in Nazi Germany, wore their country's uniform despite their country's racism, won gold medals while Hitler watched in fury, and proved that black excellence is undeniable, unstoppable, and transformative, and that's a story that deserves to be told, remembered, and shared with everyone who needs to understand how far we've come and how much those pioneers sacrificed to get us here.